Thank you. My name is Julian Smith. So thank you, Catherine. I'm actually going to follow up on what you said. I'm going to talk about main streets as cultural landscapes. Why am I doing that? Because when I started off, when we were doing early heritage conservation districts, we were working with a Ontario Heritage Act that was very community-based, very much based on a volunteer network of LACACs. It was definitely a community set of initiatives that moved up. It was a ground-up system. And the planning framework that we had in Ontario was very much top-down. I think the OMB is probably the easiest way to understand what a top-down system looks like. And I would say to communities, one of the reasons to become a heritage conservation district is, in a sense, to displace the planning regimen, because the planners don't know what heritage districts are. They've never read the Heritage Act. And so therefore you have freedom to sort of invent your own future. I think the revisions to the Heritage Act over time have made it, unfortunately, a rather expert-driven, top-down system. We've lost this idea of a community base. But the new Provincial Policy Statement does say that cultural heritage landscapes shall be protected in Ontario. And the policy statement exists above the Planning Act, above the Heritage Act. It's the highest level of policy in Ontario. And so we've begun to tell communities to designate themselves as cultural heritage landscapes, because nobody knows what that means. And that is what you want. You want the planners to be mystified, the heritage planners to be mystified, and then the community just invents what it wants, and it says, this is what it means to conserve a cultural heritage landscape. So that's my plea. What are cultural landscapes? They're cultural ideas embedded in a place. They're both the artifact and the rituals that give them life. And you can't see a cultural landscape. A cultural landscape is experienced. I think when the Glenbow Museum years ago opened its first exhibit of Aboriginal artifacts in an art gallery, and they said, we're finally giving you your due. These are beautiful works of art. The Lubicon protested, and it amazed the museum, and I would say the museum world 30 years later is still trying to come to grips with this. But what they said is, a mask is not a cultural artifact. It's not something to put in a glass box and light beautifully. A mask only becomes a cultural object when it's danced. And as it's being danced, that's the cultural reality, and that's when cultural heritage exists. So I think that combination of the artifact and the ritual is really what creates cultural landscapes. The other thing about experience is you have two cultural groups that occupy the same part of the city. Each of them creates their own cultural landscapes. So you can have cultural landscapes that are superimposed on top of each other, but they have different boundaries and different characteristics. And I think that's really important to understand, because you can do GIS mapping to whatever fine grain you want, and you will still not discover the cultural landscapes, because they exist in the cultural imagination. And the other part of this question is sustainability. So sustainability is about an ecological relationship, and I think old growth forest analogy is actually a wonderful analogy to use when thinking about this. And I think it's best understood through a cultural landscape lens, because basically a cultural landscape is the ecology where people are one of the species that we're dealing with. And it's their relationship to their habitat that becomes part of the larger set of relationships of all our species to all our habitats. One of the things I love about ecological sustainability is diversity is absolutely critical. And that's why, again, why I like the idea of cultural landscapes that may sit on top of each other. Monocultures tend to collapse on themselves. And if there's anything that gets me frustrated with the planning profession, it's that they work in a utopian model, which is to create monocultures, which are the perfect solution, whatever the trend of the day happens to be. I want to refer to two people. Jane Jacobs wrote a book in 1961, and she talks about the seeming disorder of the city. Messy urbanism is a phrase that I've used. I've written some articles about it. It's actually a problematic term, but it's being used in Asia quite a bit. In India, messy urbanism is a cause because they are being told by the World Bank to look like Singapore. The last thing they want to be is like Singapore. So they're saying, we prefer messy urbanism, but they mean ecological urbanism. They mean something that has this seeming disorder underneath which is this dance of the city. What I like about Jane is that she was absolutely dismissed because she was female, because she didn't have a PhD, because she wasn't an academic. She wasn't an expert. She based her research on talking to the community and understanding that. And 12 months later, Rachel Carson produced The Silent Spring. where, again, she says, this is an era of specialists, each of whom sees his own problem and is unaware or intolerant of the larger frame into which it fits. So she used the masculine adjective, his, because she was treated exactly the same way. How can a female scientist without a PhD even be allowed to criticize the chemical industry, which at that time, as you know, was producing DDT, among other things? And I give my students this movie, which is quite old by now, but if you want to understand Toronto, here's a perspective from an Indo-Canadian filmmaker, which gives you a sense of the fact that Toronto looks different to different communities. And that's absolutely essential to cultural landscape theory. We have a very short time, so I'm going to use Byward Market just to say, what does it mean to look at a cultural landscape and try to think about what its future might be? And I will say the process of developing the Byward Market as a heritage conservation district occurred under the old Heritage Act, when nobody defined what it was. So we designated both artifacts and rituals in the Byward Market as being protected under the Act, which nobody would allow you to do now. First, we had to establish there were many communities. The one on the left is the Byward Market as it looks to a tourist. The one in the middle is a map by a farmer, which identified far more feed stores, a stable that I didn't know existed, all sorts of things that exist in that part of the city that relate to the rural community. And the last one was done by a graduate student, and it's every single bar in the Byward Market. And that's a cultural landscape that shows up at about 10 or 11 at night and exists till 3 or 4 in the morning, and is fading just as the farmers arrive with their produce. So we had to convince council, because one of the councilors asked, said, I hope it's going to have herringbone brick paving and cast iron street lamps when you're done, if it is a heritage district. And I said, no way. We actually had to use this image of the historic Byward Market to prove that conflicts between pedestrians and vehicles was part of the heritage characteristics. This is one of the rituals that we designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. There had to be conflicts between pedestrians and vehicles. And to this day, even last year, there's a new proposal to make the whole Byward Market district pedestrian only. And I absolutely protest. I had a call from the city saying, motorcycle gangs are coming to the Byward Market, what do you recommend? The city still calls me on the Byward Market sometimes. I said, absolutely welcome them. Put aside some special parking for motorcycles. This is another community. They want this to be part of their cultural landscape. And these aren't motorcycle gangs. These are men going through midlife crises. These are beautiful. These are beautiful Harley Davidsons. Or if a teenager restores a car, they're going to go to the Byward Market because it takes you about 15 minutes to go around one block because there's so many pedestrians, and that's where you want to be. So Catherine mentioned that study in the US. What it shows is that these fine-grained older districts have more employment per square meter, more family-owned businesses, more women-owned businesses, more immigrant-owned businesses. They have more age diversity. They have more 24-hour activity diversity. So what did we do? We said in the Byward Market, you cannot get a building permit unless you build on a lot that's been there for at least 50 years. That means 25-foot lots. You can't put a Shoppers Drug Mart in a 25-foot lot, and you can't get a building permit to assemble land in the Byward Market anymore. That was a huge shift. We said we're going to put a height restriction of 3 or 4 stories. The only design guideline, there are no design guidelines, because this place has evolved over time. Every community that's arrived as an immigrant community, this was the first Irish church. Ellen Kowalchuk is here, who used to work with Margaret Carter, one of the most amazing historians I've ever dealt with, and you're going to hear from her later. Margaret was the one who did this research. The first Jewish community center, the first Italian community center, the first French, Canadian, Quebecois community in Ottawa. These were people who brought their own attitudes. There's also no signage bylaw, because I said, if in the 1860s you could paint the whole side of your building and say dry goods merchant, if we have new communities coming in who advertise their businesses in new ways, this is where we want it to happen in the Byward Market. Why control those sorts of things? Control the scale of development, the height. The only thing is that there be retail at grade, and we'll let you do what you want. So I think there have to be rules that allow a cultural landscape ecology to stay in place. And the other interesting thing was that the community drew its own boundaries for this district and developed which artifacts and rituals they wanted to protect. And when I went to the OMB, even though it was a 20-block area, by far the largest district at that time in Ontario, there was unanimous support. There wasn't a single objection except for 3 merchants who complained to the OMB that they weren't included in the boundary. So that was the only resistance to it. I just want to close with this image and just a plea. So this is moving to Toronto, which is not my city, but I have kids who live here, my parents lived here. To map a cultural landscape, you need poets, you need artists. This to me is the most accurate map I've seen of the Kensington market. Catherine and people who live there will recognize the public art on Spadina, the stores with everything out in the front yard, Bellevue Park, the music up on the north side. And well, I even like this bird because where is it? Well, I think it's in Alexandra Park. What our students found when they were looking at the Kensington market is that a planner would look at that and say, Alexandra Park is one thing, it's a modernist wasteland. Kensington market is, oh, it's a heritage district, it's all these fine-grained buildings. When we talk to the people in Alexandra Park, Bellevue Park is their living room. They feel comfortable there. That's a welcoming community. Why? Because the planners and the heritage planners have been kept out of there. We have a map that one of the students found in the archives from the 1970s. It came from the City of Toronto Planning Department. It's a map of that part of Toronto, and there's a red line along College, Dundas, Bathurst, and Spadina, and a big X, and it says, keep out. So, for basically 100 years, nobody was allowed to interfere with the ecology of the Kensington market. And I would say, designated as a cultural landscape, what does that mean? Well, we'll ask somebody like this to say, well, you map Kensington market, and this is what we're going to protect. Thank you.